Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Dumke. I am the Director of South Asian Initiatives at University of Central Florida. We are honored to have Dr. Kartikeya Singh, the Deputy Director and Fellow, Wadhwani Chair in U.S. India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Singh.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's just start from a more broader perspective. We know your expertise include many things, but much of your focus has been on energy and water and smart cities and some very particular initiatives. But if you could just give us a thumbnail sketch of where U.S.-Indian relations are right now with the Modi and Trump administrations.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can say that a lot of the uncertainty around what the relationship would be like with the change in government in the United States has been clarified thanks to the meetings between the Prime Minister and the President last June. One of the things that's certain is that a lot of the cooperation around defense is going to continue. Energy will continue to be a key pillar of cooperation. And if anything, I think when we heard Secretary Tillerson make remarks at CSIS last fall prior to his visit to India, there is a new positioning and role for India in the U.S. strategy in Asia. And he referred specifically to not the Asia-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific, in which India would be a key pillar of the U.S. strategy and would involve other countries like Japan and Australia. And we've seen some of those dialogues move forward. And like I said, the next cabinet member that's going out in just a couple of weeks here is Secretary Perry. And they're taking the ongoing energy dialogue process in a new heightened direction. They're elevating it to a strategic energy partnership, which will rest on a couple key pillars, essentially continuing the ongoing bilateral cooperation in energy technologies.
Why has the energy sector been a focus of so much cooperation and dialogue?
I think that's a good question because it was one of the ways that the previous administration, I would say the two previous administrations have really helped India to take a leadership role or understood India as a leader in that space. And if we can go back to the George W. Bush administration and the civil nuclear cooperation, that was a way to de-link the India-Pakistan equation there, allowing India to stand out on its own in U.S. foreign policy with the region. And understanding, of course, that civil nuclear energy had a role to play for India's energy demand. With the Obama administration, who had prioritized the climate change agenda, climate change and clean energy agenda, he recognized that in order for India to meet its energy demand, any assistance and support the United States could lend to India for its moonshot initiatives to deploy a large-scale renewable energy efficiency measures and improvements in its thermal power generation capacity should be championed. And it became a key, that support became a key negotiating point to bring India to be a proactive player in the UN climate negotiations in the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement. And so energy continues to be a bright spot that's easy for both sides to show examples of cooperation. Joint R&D and innovation really is remarkable. With the joint IP sharing agreement for a couple different technologies. So it's something that both sides can point to and say, look, we're doing good things.
Well, let me ask you this, because India obviously is a huge market. You have a lot of different energy needs. But what is the energy mix right now, and how is India looking to change that over time?
So the energy mix still is predominantly powered by coal, but there have been significant strides made just in the last 4 years in adding multiple gigawatts of new renewable energy capacity, particularly in solar and wind. What has been more remarkable is that India's demand-side measurement efforts and energy efficiency measures, with the help of this company called Energy Efficiency Services Limited that the government set up, has really provided tremendous savings and affected the demand growth of energy in the country. And as a result of all of these efforts, I think what we're starting to see is that there is a tremendous increase in generation capacity of electricity in the country, that transmission networks have been improved, and that there are some questions regarding if there isn't enough manufacturing sector growth, that all this power surplus really will curtail the need for new sort of thermal generation capacities that they've announced, and also brings into question whether or not how strategic they can be about rolling out even new renewable technologies. So I think those are some of the questions that still need to be explored.
You had mentioned yesterday in discussions, one of India's biggest challenge, and perhaps the Modi government's moonshots, is providing electricity to 300 million Indians who currently do not have it. How realistic is that goal, and could you describe some of the options of achieving it?
Yeah, and I think successive governments since independence have wanted to provide access to electricity to India's vast and rural population. The challenges have been, the fact that some of these places are quite remote, the fact that, cross-subsidization of residential consumers by commercial and industrial consumers have meant that the state-owned distribution companies and the energy sector was not able to put in the kinds of investments to really double down on expanding last-mile connectivity. So having a vision and solid target to meet, energy access for every household, universal energy access, is an admirable goal. The challenges that still exist are, of course, reliability of electricity and beyond connection, the flow of electrons after providing that connection, and definitions of what it means to be connected. So, of course, and this statistic has been mentioned several times, that only 10% of households in a village have to have access to electricity for the entire village to be considered electrified. And I think that's why this administration has really tried to set two goals out: 100% village electrification and then 100% household electrification. And I think one of the strategies to get every household access is actually also to provide decentralized energy systems, supported in part by solar technologies, that would at least provide lighting and mobile charging and things like that for very basic services. And of course, we've seen in this space a tremendous amount of business innovation by private sector and firms that are creating new business models to get people access to solar energy services through microgrids and pay-as-you-go systems.
Thank you for that explanation. You had mentioned earlier the issue of climate change, and obviously this was a topic of considerable discussion between the Obama administration and India. You've had a change of position in the U.S. government on climate change issue. Was there concern that this would damage the relationship, and how has that been overcome?
So yes, I think the Trump administration was probably anticipating that when the Prime Minister came for his visit last June, that certainly, just like all other world leaders had pressed him to stay with the Paris Agreement, that certainly a country that the United States had such strong relations with around climate and clean energy would bring it up. But to their surprise, India actually didn't bring it up. And to everybody's surprise, the White House fact sheet actually mentioned climate change and clean energy cooperation moving forward. So I think it reveals that the Trump administration is still being, open to the idea of engaging in this space. And of course, if we're talking about an America First policy that wants to see jobs created here, if you're not mindful to the fact that large energy markets like India are actually going towards renewables, you're kind of harming your own prospects for job growth here. And so I think everybody that works in this space has been pleasantly surprised to see that dialogue between the U.S. and India around climate, it doesn't have to be talked about in climate, but the fact that so much of the energy cooperation that would have had an impact on climate continues.
What are some of the best opportunities for American companies, governments to partner with Indian governments? That's one question. The other is, perhaps it'd be helpful if you could explain a little about your specific program and how the approach towards India is different than those of the past.
Yeah, and the project, and I think what I'm working on is hopefully a really good way for U.S. governments and companies and research institutions like UCF to more deeply engage with India on energy. I think in the last administration's sort of final hours, there was recognition that in order to really build on energy cooperation between the two countries, you needed to engage more heavily with India's states, which, according to the Indian Constitution, have a lot more authority when it comes to matters regarding electricity and the power sector. But what that strategy would look like, nobody had really thought of. And so CSIS has been supported by the U.S. Department of State to try to figure out that strategy. And one of the ways we've really done that is engage with senior officials from India's many states to identify what are their energy priorities. I think this is it's a delicate matter to engage with Indian states and on an issue that matters to their electorate, that impacts their development. And I think as an American institution, we don't want to define that agenda. We want to hear from them what are their priorities and then take it from there in order to find the right partners in the U.S. And what's been truly remarkable in this process is that it has opened up the doors beyond Washington and New Delhi for broader engagement in the process in a way that we didn't didn't see before. So for example, nearly 31 U.S. states have indicated that they're interested in engaging with India on energy. And that's quite remarkable, because then that kind of state-to-state cooperation opens the door for the companies from those states to be able to be a part of that conversation and be aware of the opportunities to deploy technologies. And most importantly, I think for institutions like UCF and others, for engaging deeply in research questions and the research opportunities in India's energy story, because there's so much noise out there in terms of what's happening in India's energy sector. And India is a laboratory where you can test out all kinds of ideas, and where essentially the choices that India makes on energy will have a tremendous impact across the planet. So for U.S. research institutions that are eager to explore how this is playing out, or are interested to collect data and find and help and assist in making evidence-based policy decision-making, it's a tremendous opportunity. And we're hoping that the process for opening these doors and state-to-state partnerships will really deepen this engagement in a new way.
Well, it's a very innovative approach, and I want to use that transition to perhaps not something a little less positive, which is, there's been a lot of talk. We've seen multiple administrations, both in India and in the U.S., different political parties in both places, committed to this relationship between Washington and New Delhi. But there are critics who say, despite all this talk, still most of the talk is about potential rather than actual benefits and gains, particularly in trade and investment. What would you say to those critics, or skeptics, I should say?
Yeah, and I think those critics and skeptics are coming from a place of experience, right? I mean, I think after India's economy opened up, there was a tremendous interest from U.S. actors, the private sector, to engage in this space and to be part of India's growth story and investment opportunities. And many of them were burned quite badly and realized that they needed to understand India more deeply and engage again beyond New Delhi with powerful state leaders who ultimately would have an impact on those business and trade ties. And I think India has come a long way since the early 90s and whatever has played out in the 2000s, early 2000s. What we've seen with this Indian central government administration is that we have a prime minister that really tried to make his home state of Gujarat, an important business destination, to remove red tape, to improve the efficiency of the bureaucracy, and to create an investor-friendly climate. And he held various investor summits to do so, the Vibrant Gujarat Summit. And now that he's at the center, his methods and promotion of cooperative and competitive federalism has really seen Indian states starting to compete with each other in terms of improving their business environments and be more friendly to investors. We at CSIS are tracking the 30 most important economic reforms that the Prime Minister could make to make the economy more investment friendly to foreign players and also be of use to India's development growth story. And I think it's important to hold their feet to the fire, to be able to say, you promised these reforms and we're keeping an eye out to see how you're progressing on them. And there has been tremendous progress in some areas. There's other areas where reforms have slowed down. I mean, there's more reforms in the first year or two than there were in the last. And I think some of that is also due to the electoral politics and how much control he has both at the center and in his trying to take control of state legislatures, which is important to bring them along for these reforms. So I would say, keep an eye out, because the story is changing. And I think as states are becoming more competitive with each other, there will certainly be some states worth going to and others that still have a lot of catching up to do.
This trend, though, towards market reforms, let's just say a BJP party has some setbacks electorally, or they've already responded with different policy mechanisms to some less than overwhelming electoral results, including in Gujarat recently. Is this reform process going to continue? Is there an inevitability to it, regardless of the political party in India who's in charge? If Congress came back, would these policies continue, more or less?
Yes, so I think if we were to look at in the lead up to the 2019 General Assembly elections in India, I would argue that based on what we saw in Gujarat and the less than expected number of seats for the BJP to win was a cautionary tale for the party that their central government macroeconomic reforms, which are very important and affect all sectors of the economy, may not have supported the needs of the rural electorate as much as needed, and some of them, as a result, didn't vote for his party. And as a result, in this latest budget for this year, you see tremendous amount of importance given to spending in rural areas for rural connectivity and rural needs. And I think so I can't anticipate that there'll be too many high-level reforms passed between now and the General Assembly elections. But should somebody else come into power, and I don't foresee that happening, I think that India is already in a trajectory of making reforms. I think people want to see, there's been enough healthy debate around some areas that reforms are likely to continue. They may, of course, if a different party comes into power, lag a little bit as the economy and the politics sort of settle down. But I think India is in a path to continue to reform.
Well, thanks. I want to take a step away from the economic discussion and talk a little about foreign policy, again, focusing on the U.S.-Indian relationship. Are these two countries share some similar interests but have different outlooks? So if you could explain just India's foreign policy priorities and how they fit in with the U.S. And I say this because there's been discussion about the impact of the U.S. deciding to cut aid to Pakistan, for example, or the U.S. talking to India and wanting them to be involved in the solution, whatever that would be, in Afghanistan, and some of the other issues going forward. Obviously, China's an issue they share a concern about, but they approach it differently. So if you could explain a little about Indian foreign policy.
Yes, I can try to unpack that. There's a number of different things there. So I think, as I mentioned, Secretary Tillerson alluding to the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific, and the continued importance of India in the United States Strategic Defense Partnership and the Defense Technology Transfer Initiative and their India Rapid Reaction Cell that was created in the Department of Defense to be able to get India more access to defense-related technologies. So I think there's definitely a security element where the U.S. wants to see India be a part of the Asia foreign policy strategy the way it sees it. I think India has to be a little bit more cautious because it does share a border dispute with China, a long-running border dispute with China, and now sees greater investments by China in neighboring countries and finds itself encircled. So India is, to its credit, holding its own in some of these areas, while the United States would like to see India get more involved militarily in Afghanistan and really have some skin in the game. And that was actually something that when this administration, the Trump administration, came to power, was expected to come up, is why isn't India actually sending troops to Afghanistan? And of course, India has been providing financial assistance, has been selling arms to Afghanistan, but it recognizes that doing so will also aggravate things and increase tensions with Pakistan. At the same time, I think nobody gave India its due for actually facing off against Chinese troops on foreign soil in the Doklam Pass in Bhutan. And no other country has been doing that. And so I think that maybe is being recognized to some degree as, this is how India is trying to put on a greater show of strength against the northern neighbor. And as I mentioned a little bit yesterday, to counter the geopolitics of the Belt and Road Initiative, India is trying to have investments and it's going act east instead of just look east in its East Asia and Southeast Asia policy. But while that's all good, it certainly needs to improve internal connectivity to make that a reality. And one of the ways that it can actually do that from mainland India into its northeast is to actually bolster ties with Bangladesh. And I think this Indian administration has actually improved ties, connectivity ties, and ties on energy with Bangladesh in a way that we haven't seen before. Of course, Bangladesh is having elections this year, so let's see if the ruling party there weathers the political storm. But so I think greater ties to Bangladesh are part of its Act East policy and trying to make that part of the neighborhood, South Asia, more secure. And then, of course, more ties to Africa. I think India will never be able to compete with China in terms of infrastructure investments, but it does have other technologies and skills and trainings and things like that it can provide. And we've seen that the annual India-Africa Summit has been going on for a couple of years. Heads of African nations, ministers actually met in the Indian state of Gujarat, actually, more recently. So India is positioning itself in various different domains, both in Asia and Africa, which are its immediate neighborhood, as a way to prioritize its foreign policy goals.
Well, Japan is an important partner of India. How does that fit into the policy?
Yeah, I think Japan has been doing a lot of infrastructure investments in India. And actually, more interestingly, the United States and Japan announced when President Trump and Premier Abe met recently that they would have joint cooperation on special infrastructure projects and special emerging technologies in third-party countries. And that could actually be a way for the U.S. to have a more proactive role in infrastructure investments with a partner that is an ally and actually has the capital to spend on large infrastructure projects. And given that both the U.S. and Japan have active, ongoing, large-scale infrastructure projects, or at least Japan does, but the U.S. is working on a few smart cities initiatives, and as I mentioned, the energy cooperation, this could really be an opportunity to enhance that cooperation and bring the strengths that both countries have to help India develop the kinds of infrastructure it needs to be able to compete with countries like China and other emerging countries, which are frankly quite competitive when it comes to attracting business and manufacturing and the like.
Let's shift back to energy and kind of picking up on what you just said about Japan. What is the U.S. advantage or the Indian advantage of working with American partners on energy projects, and where do other possible competitors such as EU countries fit into the mix, or Japan?
So the U.S. advantage is really, let's start actually with our incredible R&D capabilities. Nowhere in the world is there a network of national laboratories that's been supported by a federal government, like in the U.S., that has cutting-edge research happening, technologies that have been deployed that are just begging to be commercialized, which I know the Department of Energy is placing special emphasis on right now. And as a result, supported also in part by the tremendous amount that certain states are emphasizing in supporting energy innovation and entrepreneurship. That is really truly American and unique, and that's where the U.S. takes a lead. And I think India wants both of these things. It wants to be a heavyweight in the R&D space. It was part of the grouping of countries in the Paris Agreement that also signed the Mission Innovation Agreement to double its R&D in clean energy technologies in the next 5 years. And it also now has these campaigns called Startup India and the Udall Innovation Mission, which seeks to set up 100 incubators across the country and support the growth of entrepreneurship, which will really help address the job issue in India. You have so many people that need jobs on an annual basis that are coming to the job market. If the Indian economy can be structured in a way to support entrepreneurs, that they can create their own businesses, that they can have access to technologies, that they can be innovators, that will really actually support the growth of the country in a more stable way and be a long-term growth engine. And that's where I think the U.S. advantage really comes from, in a way that it doesn't in Japan and the EU. I've looked a little bit at the entrepreneurship ecosystem in Japan, and it's just much different. I think even how people process failure has an impact on how we champion entrepreneurship, and that's just something that U.S. entrepreneurs and frankly Indian entrepreneurs are not afraid to do.
Well, we've talked about energy cooperation. You also mentioned defense earlier as a big component. What are some of the other sectors that you anticipate being highlighted here in the U.S.-Indian context here? So,
other areas that I think could be highlighted are in the area of healthcare. There are tremendous, and this is not just opportunities for the U.S. to sell things in India, but actually for the U.S. companies and other stakeholders to learn from how tremendous new price points for things in the pharmaceutical sector, in innovations and actual medical device technologies can be reached that are being innovated in India. And I think that's going to be an area to look out for because of the sheer population size and the need to have healthcare services and technologies be much lower than they are in the United States. That's something that I think even U.S. citizens can appreciate, given the costs of healthcare here. What can we learn from India? So that's going to be an area that should be watched closely. I think also in the automotive sector and artificial intelligence, this is an area that the U.S. and China are frankly the ones putting the most resources in, but India is also hoping to do that. And I think it may seem like it's a little bit further down the line, but it's coming. And I think there will be joint cooperation in that space. Speaking of space research, is an area that, again, India has really lowered the cost of taking things out to space. And there's tremendous value add there for U.S. companies to send their satellites out, for India to be a part of international space research collaboration and the types of technologies that come out of that kind of R&D. So I think that's another area that could be a growth possibility for both countries to cooperate on.
Well, thank you. I got one final question. You yourself were born in India, and then you grew up in the U.S. What role does the Indian expat community in the U.S. play in this relationship as it grows and moves forward?
That is a great question. I think for a long time, the Indian community that I think immigrated to the U.S. They joined, a growth story of this country, and maybe I don't know that I can speak for everybody, but you sort of left behind India. Of course, it was always in your heart, but you always saw it as a place with tremendous opportunity, but things weren't really moving there. And I think things have changed since the economy opened up in the 90s, since the boom of the services sector. India's rightly tried to gain access to a seat at the high table in many international fora, and now you see a lot of pride by Indian American community in what India is capable of. And with this Modi administration wanting to tap into the diaspora community and not fully, I think, having a vision for what that looks like, I think those Indian communities across the U.S. that are organizing in a new way to not only just have be more visible in the fabric of American society, but think about ways that they can enhance business ties with India. This is, I think, the moment to try to connect with that vision, where India is actually reaching out more aggressively to the diaspora community to bring in investment. And I think they've, again, made some reforms to make it easier to do so, and also made it easier to get people back there. And there's a range of fellowship programs that, as I learned, even UCF faculty have taken advantage of to go back and teach in India, some of the leading institutions. So I think this is the time for the diaspora community to really try to reconnect with the growth story of India.
Kartikeya Singh, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.